"Do you want to split me in half, cowboy?" she cried, clinging to the trunk. Doubting the old man, the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a sun that seemed determined to bleach every living thing into submission. Dust devils spiraled across the flatlands, carrying with them the scent of creosote and desperation. It was 1879, and the land belonged to whoever could survive it long enough to claim ownership. Vera Hastings pressed her back against the wooden seat of the supply wagon, feeling every rut and stone through the thin cushion beneath her. Her traveling dress, once a respectable shade of deep green, had faded to something closer to sage after 3 weeks on the trail from St. Louis. The bonnet she wore did little to protect her face from the relentless glare, and she could feel her skin tightening with each passing hour. The wagon driver, a weathered man named Pickett, who spoke approximately 12 words per day, had warned her that the final stretch to Copper Ridge would be the hardest. He had not been exaggerating. The road, if it could be called that, was little more than a suggestion carved into hardpan by previous travelers, brave or foolish, enough to venture this far into territory that the government map still labeled as disputed. Vera had left behind a life that no longer fit. Her father's printing business had gone bankrupt after he made the fatal error of extending credit to men who valued whiskey more than their word. Her mother had died 2 winters past from pneumonia. Her older brother had disappeared into the California goldfields and never returned. The house had been sold to pay debts, and Vera found herself with 3 options. Accept a proposal from Gerald Whitmore, a banker twice her age with breath like spoiled meat. Take a position as a domestic servant in a household where the master's eyes lingered too long. Or answer an advertisement for a school teacher in a mining town she had never heard of. She chose the third option. Copper Ridge needed someone who could teach children to read and cipher. The town council had written that they would provide room and board in addition to a modest salary. The letter had been formal, almost desperate in its formality, and Vera suspected that few educated women were willing to relocate to a place where Apache raids were still a recent memory and civilization was measured by the distance between saloons. The wagon crested a rise and Pickett finally broke his silence. "Town's yonder. Be there before nightfall if the axle holds." Vera shaded her eyes and looked toward the horizon. Copper Ridge appeared as a collection of dark shapes shimmering in the heat haze, tucked against a range of rust-colored hills that looked like the exposed ribs of some ancient beast. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and she could make out the skeletal framework of what might be a church steeple under construction. The wagon descended into a shallow valley where the vegetation grew slightly thicker, stunted mesquite and palo verde trees clinging to life near a dry wash that probably ran with water during the monsoon season. The air felt heavier here, trapped between the hills, and carried with it the metallic tang of the copper ore that gave the town its name. As they approached, Vera began to distinguish individual buildings. Most were rough wood construction, unpainted and weathered gray by sun and wind. A few had been built from adobe bricks, their walls thick enough to provide relief from the heat. The main street was wider than she expected, designed to accommodate ore wagons and freight haulers. She counted 2 saloons, a general store, a livery stable, what appeared to be a boarding house, and several other establishments whose purposes were not immediately clear. Men stopped their work to watch the wagon pass. Their stares were not hostile, merely curious, the way people in isolated places examined anything new that arrived from the outside world. Vera kept her gaze forward, maintaining the posture her mother had drilled into her. Back straight, chin level, hands folded. She was here to teach, to establish herself as a respectable professional, and first impressions mattered. Pickett guided the wagon to a stop in front of a building that bore a hand-painted sign reading Town Hall and Mining Office. Before Vera could gather her belongings, a portly man in a vest emerged from the doorway, mopping his face with a handkerchief. "Miss Hastings, I presume? I'm Cornelius Webb, chairman of the town council. We've been expecting you." His voice carried the rounded vowels of someone educated back east, though his clothing and weathered appearance suggested he had long since adapted to frontier life. He helped Vera down from the wagon with surprising gentleness for a man of his bulk. "The journey was longer than anticipated," Vera said, accepting his assistance. "I hope I haven't caused any inconvenience." "Not at all, not at all. We're simply grateful you've arrived." Finding qualified teachers willing to venture this far west has proven challenging. Webb directed two younger men to unload Vera's trunk and carpet bag while he walked her toward the boarding house. The street felt almost surreal after weeks of open trail, the presence of buildings and defined spaces creating an odd sense of confinement. "You'll be staying with Mrs. Kowalski. She runs a respectable establishment, very clean, good meals. The schoolhouse is being finished as we speak. Should be ready in another week or two. In the meantime, we thought you might want to settle in, get your bearings." Vera noticed that several windows along the street now framed female faces, women assessing the newcomer with expressions that ranged from friendly curiosity to cool evaluation. In a town like this, she realized any new woman would shift the social dynamics, especially one young and unmarried. The boarding house was a two-story structure with a covered porch that offered precious shade. A woman who could only be Mrs. Kowalski emerged to greet them, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. "So this is our new teacher. You look half-starved, child. Come inside, I've got stew on." The interior was blessedly cool, thick adobe walls keeping the heat at bay. The rooms were spartanly furnished but immaculately maintained, and Vera felt something in her chest unclench slightly. This would do. This would be fine. Webb excused himself after confirming that Vera would meet with the council in 2 days to discuss the curriculum and expectations. Mrs. Kowalski showed her to a small room on the second floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the hills. "Supper's at 6. Don't be late or the miners will eat everything including the tablecloth." Vera unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 spare dresses in the wardrobe and arranging her books on the small shelf near the bed. She had brought teaching primers, a Bible, and the collected works of Shakespeare, possibly the only copy within 200 miles. As she worked, exhaustion settled over her like a physical weight. That night, she lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town. Distant laughter from the saloons, the rhythmic clang of the stamp mill processing ore even after dark, the occasional bark of a dog. The mattress was harder than what she was accustomed to, and the pillow smelled faintly of lye soap. But she had made it. Against all odds and despite all fears, she had traveled across half a continent to start something new. The following morning arrived with a rooster's crow and the smell of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Vera dressed quickly, braiding her hair and pinning it in a practical coil at the nape of her neck. When she descended to the dining room, she found it occupied by 3 men in work clothes and one older woman who nodded politely but said nothing. Mrs. Kowalski served breakfast with efficient movements, placing plates of eggs, biscuits, and bacon before her guests. The food was simple but plentiful, and Vera ate with an appetite sharpened by weeks of trail rations. "You'll want to see the town today," Mrs. Kowalski said as she refilled coffee cups. "Get your bearings before you start teaching. Stay on the main streets, mind yourself around the miners when they've been drinking, and for heaven's sake don't wander toward the slag heaps. Ground's unstable and full of scorpions." Vera spent the morning exploring Copper Ridge, mapping its geography in her mind. The general store was run by a taciturn man named Simmons who stocked everything from mining equipment to ladies' bonnets, though his selection of the latter was limited and several seasons out of fashion. The church was indeed under construction, its framework rising against the sky like a promise of permanence. She introduced herself to several townspeople, receiving responses that ranged from warm welcomes to polite but distant acknowledgement. The social hierarchy here was different from what she knew. Wealth was measured not in family lineage but in working claims and the ability to survive. Education was respected but not revered. Usefulness trumped refinement. By noon, the heat had become oppressive, and Vera retreated to the boarding house. Mrs. Kowalski was working in the kitchen, kneading dough with practiced efficiency. "You'll need to pace yourself in this climate. Heat stroke kills faster than rattlesnakes out here." Over the next several days, Vera settled into a routine. She met with the town council, reviewed the partially completed schoolhouse, and began planning lessons for students whose ages and abilities ranged wildly. She learned that most children worked alongside their parents and could only attend school irregularly, which meant her teaching methods would need to be flexible and efficient. She also learned about the mine itself. The Copper Ridge deposit was rich enough to support the town, but not wealthy enough to attract the large mining corporations. Most claims were worked by independent miners or small partnerships, men who risked everything on the chance of striking a vein that would change their fortunes. It was during her second week in town that Vera first saw Colton Rivers. She had walked to the edge of town where the schoolhouse stood, wanting to assess its progress. The carpenters had finished the roof and were working on the interior walls. As she approached, she noticed a man standing near the building, examining the foundation with an expression of intense concentration. He was tall, perhaps an inch over 6 feet, with a build that suggested both strength and endurance rather than bulk. His clothes were work-worn but clean, dark trousers, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a leather vest that had seen better days. His hat was pulled low, shading his face, but she could see a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of beard and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. What struck her most were his hands. Even from a distance, she could see they were capable hands, scarred and calloused, but moving with precision as he ran his fingers along a seam in the foundation stones. He looked up as she approached, and Vera found herself meeting eyes the color of winter slate. They were measuring eyes, the kind that assessed situations quickly and reached conclusions without wasting time on unnecessary politeness. "You're the new teacher." It was a statement, rather than a question, delivered in a voice that carried the rough edges of someone who spent more time with horses and stone than people. "I am Vera Hastings." She extended her hand automatically, a gesture of professional courtesy. He looked at it for a moment as if surprised by the formality, then grasped it briefly. His palm was rough against hers and warm from the sun. "Colton Rivers. I've got the timber claim up in the hills, supplying lumber for the school. The work appears well done. It'll hold. Built it to last, not to look pretty." There was no hostility in his tone, merely a statement of priorities that reflected the pragmatism of frontier life. Vera found herself oddly conscious of his presence, the way he occupied space with an economy of movement that suggested someone comfortable with solitude. "The children will appreciate having a proper building," she said, searching for neutral ground in the conversation. "Kids need more than buildings. They need someone who won't quit when things get hard." The words landed with unexpected weight, and Vera felt her spine straighten involuntarily. "I assure you, Mr. Rivers, I have no intention of quitting." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but perhaps an acknowledgment of her response. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell and turned back toward a wagon loaded with freshly cut timber. Vera watched him go, unsettled by the brief exchange. There had been something in the way he looked at her, not dismissive exactly, but skeptical, as if he had seen too many outsiders arrive with good intentions and leave when reality proved harsher than expectations. She pushed the encounter from her mind and focused on the work ahead. The schoolhouse would open in 10 days, and she had lessons to plan, materials to organize, and a reputation to establish. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the distant sounds of the stamp mill, she found herself thinking about winter gray eyes and rough hands that built things to last. The days acquired a rhythm. Vera worked with the carpenters to ensure the schoolhouse met her needs, arranged for slates and primers from the general store, and met with several mothers who wanted to assess whether she was suitable to teach their children. These interviews were more rigorous than any she had endured back east, as frontier women valued practicality over credentials. She saw Colton Rivers twice more before the school opened. Once, he was delivering another load of lumber, working alongside the carpenters with the efficient movements of someone who understood construction. The second time, she encountered him outside the general store, where he was loading supplies onto a pack mule. Their conversations were brief, constrained by the formality of their respective positions. He was a timberman, someone who worked alone in the hills and came to town only for supplies and business. She was the school teacher, expected to maintain a certain decorum and distance. Yet Vera found herself noticing details. The way he always held doors for women without making a show of it. How he paid for his supplies in silver coin rather than credit. The fact that his boots, though worn, were well maintained. The schoolhouse opened on a Monday morning in late September. Vera arrived early, her stomach tight with anticipation. She had arranged the rough wooden benches in rows, placed the slate board prominently at the front, and written the alphabet in careful letters across its surface. 14 children arrived over the first hour, ranging in age from 6 to 15. Some came alone. Others were delivered by parents who lingered to observe. Vera took attendance, assessed reading levels, and began with a simple geography lesson, using a map she had brought from St. Louis to show the children where they lived in relation to the rest of the country. The students were a mixed group, some eager to learn, others resentful of time taken from work. Vera adapted her teaching on the fly, recognizing that formal methods would need to bend to practical realities. She praised effort, corrected gently, and established rules that were firm but fair. By the end of the first week, she had begun to understand the unique challenges of teaching in a mining town. Students disappeared for days at a time when their labor was needed at home claims. Some arrived hungry, unable to concentrate until she quietly shared portions of her own lunch. Others struggled with material that assumed a level of prior education they simply did not possess. But there were victories, too. A 10-year-old girl named Margaret discovered a love for reading and devoured every book Vera could provide. 2 brothers who had been illiterate learned to write their names. A shy boy revealed a talent for mathematics that suggested he might someday become an engineer or surveyor. Vera threw herself into the work, finding purpose in the small daily triumphs. She stayed late to help struggling students, arrived early to prepare lessons, and spent her evenings creating materials from whatever resources she could find. The townspeople began to respect her dedication, and invitations to Sunday dinners started arriving from families who wanted to show their appreciation. It was during one of these dinners at the home of the Webb family that Vera learned more about Colton Rivers. Cornelius Webb's wife, Martha, was a woman who believed that information was currency and conversation was commerce. Over roasted chicken and potatoes, she provided Vera with a comprehensive overview of the town's social landscape, including biographical sketches of various residents. Colton Rivers, now there's a complicated man, Martha said, refilling Vera's glass with lemonade. Came here about 5 years ago, bought the timber rights to that whole northern section of hill country. Works it alone, which most men couldn't manage. Brings down lumber when the town needs it, keeps to himself otherwise. He seems very capable, Vera offered neutrally. Oh, he's capable, all right. But there's tragedy there. Had a wife back in Colorado, according to what I heard. She died in childbirth, along with the baby. He left everything behind and ended up here. Never talks about it, never courts anyone. Just works and lives up in those hills like he's punishing himself for something. Vera felt an unexpected tightness in her chest at this information. She had recognized something in Colton Rivers' eyes during their brief encounters, a kind of guarded isolation that she understood from her own experience of loss. People who had been broken learned to protect the pieces that remained. "That's terribly sad," she said quietly. "Life out here is hard on everyone," Martha continued. "But some people let it make them bitter, and others just get quiet. Colton's the quiet kind. Good man, though. Honest, keeps his word, helps neighbors when there's need, even if he doesn't socialize much." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Vera found herself thinking about the timberman who lived alone in the hills, cutting trees and building things to last while keeping the world at arm's length. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the higher elevations. The stamp mill continued its relentless rhythm, and the town prepared for the winter months when travel would become more difficult and the community would turn inward. Vera had established herself as a fixture in Copper Ridge. Her students showed measurable progress, and several parents had approached the town council to express their satisfaction. She attended church services in the nearly completed building, participated in community gatherings, and maintained the professional demeanor expected of a schoolteacher. But beneath the routine, she felt a restlessness that she could not quite name. She had escaped one life and built another, yet something remained incomplete. At night, she sometimes stood at her window looking toward the hills where Colton Rivers worked his timber claim, wondering about the man who had chosen isolation over integration, who built things to last in a place where everything seemed temporary. It was a Saturday in mid-October when circumstances forced their paths to cross in a way that would change everything. Vera had decided to explore beyond the immediate vicinity of town, wanting to see more of the landscape that would be her home. Mrs. Kowalski had warned her not to venture too far alone, but Vera was confident in her ability to handle a simple afternoon walk. She followed a trail that led toward the foothills, enjoying the slightly cooler air and the way the afternoon light painted the rocks in shades of amber and rust. The vegetation grew more varied here, and she stopped occasionally to examine plants she did not recognize, wishing she had brought a botanical guide. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when she realized the sun was lower than she had anticipated. The shadows were lengthening rapidly, and she needed to turn back soon to reach town before dark. But as she turned, she noticed something that made her pause. Smoke was rising from a location perhaps a mile distant, a dark column that stood out starkly against the pale sky. As she watched, the smoke thickened, and she could hear a sound like wind rushing through a canyon. Fire. In this dry landscape, fire was a terror that could consume everything in its path. Vera stood frozen for a moment, calculating distances and directions. The fire appeared to be between her current position and the town, and the wind was pushing it toward more populated areas. She needed to move, and quickly. Vera gathered her skirts and began walking rapidly back the way she had come. But within minutes, she realized the situation was worse than she had thought. The wind had picked up, and the smoke was spreading faster than seemed possible. She could see flames now, orange tongues licking at dry grass and brush, moving with terrifying speed. Her walk became a run, but the trail that had seemed so clear earlier now looked confusing in the changing light and smoke. She took what she thought was the correct path, but after 10 minutes of running, she emerged into an area she did not recognize. Panic began to claw at the edges of her mind. The smoke was thicker here, burning her throat and making her eyes water. She could hear the fire now, a sound like a living thing breathing and consuming. The heat was increasing, and embers were beginning to fall around her like deadly snow. Vera forced herself to think. Running blindly would only lead her deeper into danger. She needed height, needed to see where she was in relation to the fire and the town. There was an outcropping of rock ahead, and she scrambled toward it, ignoring the way stones bit into her palms and the thorns of desert plants caught at her dress. From the top of the rocks, she could see the full scope of the disaster. The fire had created its own wind, feeding on itself and spreading in multiple directions. Copper Ridge was not immediately threatened, but the flames were definitely between her current position and safety. To her left, perhaps half a mile distant, she could see what looked like a larger rock formation or possibly a shallow canyon. If she could reach it, there might be shelter from the fire, a place where the flames would pass over or around rather than consuming everything in their path. She descended from the outcrop and began moving toward her target, trying to balance speed with caution. The smoke was making it hard to breathe, and she tied her handkerchief over her nose and mouth, though it provided little relief. She had covered perhaps half the distance when she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of the fire had changed pitch, becoming a roar that suggested it was moving faster, possibly driven by a wind shift. Vera looked back and saw a wall of flame advancing across the landscape like a nightmare given physical form. She ran then, abandoning all caution, her only thought to reach shelter before the fire reached her. The ground was rough and treacherous. Twice she stumbled, catching herself on rocks that scraped skin from her palms. Her lungs burned from smoke and exertion. The heat was intense now, a physical pressure that seemed to push against her back, urging her to move faster than her body could manage. She burst into a clearing and saw the rock formation ahead, larger than she had realized from a distance. It was a jumble of massive boulders that formed natural walls and overhangs, the kind of place that might offer protection if she could get deep enough inside. But between her and safety stood an obstacle she had not anticipated, a dry wash perhaps 15 feet wide and 8 feet deep, its sides nearly vertical where flash floods had carved through layers of sediment. Vera skidded to a stop at the edge, desperately searching for a way across or around. There was no time. The fire was seconds away, the heat now so intense that she could feel her skin tightening, her clothes beginning to scorch. A movement caught her eye. On the far side of the wash, emerging from between two boulders, was Colton Rivers. He took in the situation instantly, his expression grim but focused. He was holding an axe, and there was soot on his face and clothes, suggesting he had been fighting the fire or fleeing from it himself. The tree! He was pointing to her left, and Vera turned to see a dead juniper that had partially fallen across the wash, one end resting on each bank. It was perhaps 18 inches in diameter, its bark long gone, the wood weathered to silver gray. There was no alternative and no time to debate. Vera gathered her skirts as best she could and stepped onto the log. It shifted slightly under her weight but held. She took another step, then another, trying not to look at the drop below or think about what would happen if she fell. Halfway across, she made the mistake of looking back. The fire had reached the clearing, flames consuming everything in their path. The heat was overwhelming, and smoke filled her lungs despite the handkerchief. She coughed, lost her balance slightly, and felt the log shift again under her feet. Terror froze her in place. She was suspended above the wash, fire behind her, an 8-foot drop below, and a treacherous log her only path to safety. Her legs began to shake, and she felt her vision starting to tunnel. "Don't stop." Colton's voice cut through the panic. "Keep moving." But she could not. Her body refused to obey, every muscle locked in place by fear. On the far bank, Colton made a decision. He stepped onto the log from his side and began walking toward her with steady, confident steps that suggested he had crossed far more dangerous obstacles than this. When he reached her, he extended his hand. "Take it." Vera looked at his hand, then at his face. His expression was intense but not unkind, demanding trust in a moment when trust was the only currency that mattered. She reached out, and his fingers closed around hers with a grip that was firm and steady. The contact provided an anchor, something solid in a world that had become smoke and fire and terror. One step at a time. "I've got you." With Colton's hand holding hers and his presence providing stability, Vera found she could move again. They crossed the remaining distance together, his confidence somehow transferring through their joined hands. When they reached the far bank, he helped her down and immediately pulled her toward the shelter of the rock formation. Get inside, as far back as you can. The space between the boulders was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. Vera squeezed through, scraping her shoulders against rough stone, until she reached a wider area where the rocks formed a natural cave perhaps 6 feet deep and 4 feet high. Colton followed, his larger frame requiring him to turn sideways to fit through the narrow entrance. Once inside, he positioned himself between Vera and the opening, his body forming an additional barrier against the heat and flames. The fire reached the wash and seemed to pause, as if considering whether to leap the gap. Flames reached toward the sky, creating their own wind that howled through the rocks with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming. The heat inside their shelter became almost unbearable, sucking the air from their lungs and making every breath feel like inhaling fire. Vera pressed herself against the back wall, her eyes squeezed shut against the brightness and heat. She felt Colton's presence beside her, solid and steady even as the world outside tried to consume everything. Time became meaningless. The fire might have lasted 5 minutes or 5 hours. All Vera knew was heat and noise and the desperate hope that the rocks above them would not become too hot, would not crack and collapse, would not turn their shelter into an oven. And then, gradually, the roar began to diminish. The heat lessened incrementally. The brightness visible even through closed eyelids began to fade. Vera opened her eyes and saw that the fire had passed over and around them, leaving the ground scorched and smoking, but no longer actively burning. The landscape that had been covered in dry grass and brush now looked like a vision of hell, blackened and still smoking, with occasional small flames licking at stubborn fuel. Colton remained motionless for several moments, his eyes scanning the scorched landscape with the careful attention of someone who understood that danger rarely announced when it had truly passed. Finally, he shifted and looked back at Vera. "We need to wait. Ground's still hot, and there might be spot fires." His voice was rough from smoke, and Vera realized her own throat felt raw and damaged. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. They sat in uncomfortable silence, the aftermath of terror settling over them like a physical weight. As the immediate danger receded, Vera became acutely aware of their proximity. The shelter was small enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He smelled of smoke and sweat and something else, something that reminded her of pine forests and clean mountain air. "Thank you," she managed finally. "You saved my life." Colton turned to look at her, and in the dim light filtering through the smoke, his gray eyes were unreadable. "You shouldn't have been out here alone. This country doesn't forgive mistakes." There was no anger in his tone, just a statement of fact that carried the weight of hard-earned experience. Vera felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I didn't realize how far I had walked. The fire came so quickly. Lightning strike probably, up in the dry timber. Wind did the rest." He shifted position, checking the entrance again, then settling back with his long legs stretched out as much as the cramped space allowed. Vera noticed for the first time that his left forearm bore a fresh burn, an angry red stripe where an ember must have caught him. "You're injured." He glanced down as if surprised to find the wound on his own arm. "It's nothing. I've had worse," but Vera was already reaching for her handkerchief. It was filthy with soot, but at least it was cloth. She dampened it with water from the small canteen that Colton had attached to his belt, and before he could protest, she was gently cleaning the burn. He went very still under her ministrations, his body tensing in a way that had nothing to do with pain. Vera focused on the task, trying to ignore the feeling of his skin under her fingers, the corded muscle of his forearm. "There. It should be cleaned at least, though it needs proper dressing once we return to town." "Obliged." The word was clipped, formal, a retreat back into the distance he seemed to maintain from everyone. But when Vera met his eyes, she saw something there that had not been present before, a crack in the armor of his isolation. They waited another 20 minutes before Colton deemed it safe enough to venture out. The landscape had been transformed into something alien and hostile. What had been covered in vegetation now lay bare and black, the earth itself seeming wounded. "Stay close," Colton said, picking up his axe, "and step where I step." They made their way carefully across the devastated clearing and back toward the wash. The fallen juniper that had served as Vera's bridge now smoldered, its ancient wood finally succumbing to flame. They had to find another crossing point, which Colton located 100 yards downstream where the banks were less steep. The journey back to town took over an hour, following paths that avoided the worst of the burned areas. Colton moved with the confidence of someone who knew this country intimately, reading the land in ways Vera was only beginning to understand. As they crested the final rise that brought Copper Ridge into view, Vera felt relief flood through her. The town had been spared, the fire having burned itself out before reaching the outlying buildings. Their arrival caused an immediate commotion. Mrs. Kowalski emerged from the boarding house with a cry of relief, followed quickly by several townspeople who had been preparing search parties. "Thank God. We saw the fire and feared the worst." Cornelius Webb pushed through the gathering crowd, his face flushed with concern. "Miss Hastings, are you injured?" "I'm unharmed, thanks to Mr. Rivers. He found me in time." Eyes turned to Colton, who stood slightly apart from the group, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, but said nothing. "You have the town's gratitude, Rivers," Webb said formally. "No need. Just happened to be in the area checking my timber stands." It was a lie, Vera realized. He had been fighting the fire or fleeing from it, not casually checking on trees. But before she could say anything, he was already turning away, moving toward the livery stable. "Mr. Rivers, wait." He stopped but did not turn around immediately. "Your arm needs proper treatment. Please, at least let someone tend it properly." For a moment, she thought he would refuse. But something in her expression must have reached him because he gave a curt nod. "In the morning. I need to check on my camp first." Then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk with the same quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize everything he did. Mrs. Kowalski swept Vera into the boarding house, clucking over her soot-stained dress and smoke-damaged hair. A bath was drawn, clothes were brought, and a substantial meal appeared. Vera submitted to the fussing, too exhausted to protest. That night, clean and fed and safe in her narrow bed, Vera lay awake replaying the day's events. The terror of the fire had been real and immediate, but what lingered in her mind was the feeling of Colton's hand holding hers on that log, the steadiness of his presence in the rock shelter. She had come to Copper Ridge to teach, to build a new life based on independence and purpose. Romance had not been part of her plan, especially not with a man who lived half wild in the hills and wore his grief like a second skin. But the heart, she was discovering, paid little attention to plans. The following days brought a return to routine, though the burned landscape visible from town served as a constant reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. Vera resumed teaching, and her students peppered her with questions about the fire. Colton did not come to town for his arm to be treated, and Vera found herself watching for him with an attention that felt both foolish and inevitable. She told herself it was simple gratitude, concern for someone who had risked himself on her behalf, but she knew it was more than that. It was nearly 2 weeks before she saw him again. She was leaving the general store when she spotted him loading lumber onto a wagon. His movements were slightly stiff, favoring his left arm. She approached before she could talk herself out of it. "Mr. Rivers." He turned, surprise flickering briefly across his features. "Miss Hastings, glad to see you're well." "I am, thanks to you. How is your arm?" "Healing fine." She could see the lie in the careful way he moved, and before she could stop herself, she was speaking with a firmness that surprised them both. "Let me see it." "That's not necessary. Let me see it, or I will make a scene right here on Main Street." Something that might have been amusement touched his eyes. He glanced around, clearly calculating whether she was serious, then rolled up his sleeve to reveal the burn. It was healing, but poorly. The edges were angry and red, and Vera could see signs of infection beginning. This needs proper care. Come with me. I don't have time for now, Mr. Rivers, unless you want to lose the arm entirely. After a moment's hesitation, he followed her back to the boarding house. Mrs. Kowalski took one look at the wound and immediately began gathering supplies, clean water, carbolic solution, fresh bandages, and a jar of salve. They settled at the kitchen table, and Vera carefully cleaned the burn with practiced movements. Colton sat rigid, his jaw clenched against pain he refused to acknowledge, watching her face rather than his arm. You should have had this treated immediately, she said quietly. I've survived worse with less. That's not the point. You saved my life. The least I can do is ensure you don't lose a limb through sheer stubbornness. Didn't save you for payment or gratitude. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. Then why did you? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Colton held her gaze for a long moment before looking away, because it was the right thing to do. Vera finished wrapping the clean bandage around his forearm, her fingers lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. There, come back in 3 days and I'll change the dressing. I can manage. 3 days, Mr. Rivers. Or I'll come to your camp myself. That almost smile touched his lips again. You're a stubborn woman, Miss Hastings. I've been called worse. He stood, rolling his sleeve back down carefully. 3 days then, and it's Colton. Seems foolish to stand on formality with someone who's seen me looking like death warmed over. Vera, she replied, and you didn't look that bad. You're a terrible liar. After he left, Mrs. Kowalski emerged from where she had been tactfully occupying herself in the pantry. That's an interesting development. I was simply treating an injury. Of course you were, dear. Just like he just happened to be in the area when the fire broke out. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed. Colton came to town more frequently than his business strictly required, often timing his arrivals to coincide with when Vera might be finishing at the school. They would talk, brief conversations that gradually grew longer. He was not a man given to easy conversation, but Vera discovered that when he did speak, his words carried weight and observation. He noticed things others missed, the way the light changed with the seasons, the patterns of animal tracks that told stories about the land. In turn, she found herself sharing more than she intended. She told him about St. Louis, about her family's losses, about the decision to come west. He listened with an attention that was both flattering and slightly unsettling. The town noticed, of course. Martha Webb made pointed comments about what a fine couple they would make. Mrs. Kowalski smiled knowingly whenever Colton appeared. Even some of Vera's students began asking innocent questions about the timberman. Vera tried to maintain professional distance, but it became increasingly difficult when she found herself looking forward to his visits, when his rare smiles became something she worked to earn. November arrived with cooler temperatures and the first dusting of snow on the higher peaks. The mining season was winding down, and Copper Ridge prepared for winter's isolation. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything shifted. Vera had been working at the church when she heard raised voices near one of the saloons. A group of men had gathered, their postures aggressive. As she drew closer, she recognized Colton in the center, facing 3 miners whose faces were flushed with alcohol and anger. You think you're better than us, living up there alone. One was shouting, I mind my business. I suggest you do the same, Colton replied evenly. Maybe we should teach you some manners. The largest miner stepped forward, clearly intent on starting a fight. Vera acted without thinking, stepping between them. That's enough. This is a respectable town. If you have grievances, take them to the marshal, not the street. The miners stopped, clearly not having expected interference from the schoolteacher. This ain't your concern, miss. It becomes my concern when it happens in front of families. You're drunk. Go sleep it off before you do something you'll regret. Her voice carried authority, and surprisingly, it worked. The miners grumbled but began to disperse. When they were gone, Vera turned to find Colton watching her with an expression somewhere between exasperation and admiration. That was foolish. They could have turned on you, but they didn't. And you shouldn't have to deal with that simply because you choose to keep to yourself. I can handle drunk miners, Vera. I know you can. But you shouldn't have to. Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger and infinitely more vulnerable. Walk with me? They left the main street, following a path that led toward the edge of town. Neither spoke for several minutes, but the silence felt comfortable. Finally, Colton stopped at a point that offered a view of the valley. I need to tell you something. About why I came here, why I live the way I do. Vera remained quiet, sensing that interruption would break whatever fragile resolve had brought him to this moment. I had a wife, Emily. We met in Colorado, got married young. She got pregnant, and we were happy about it. His voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of old pain. The birth went wrong. In a town with a real doctor, she might have survived. But we were in a mining camp with nothing but a drunk sawbones. She bled out in front of me, and there wasn't a thing I could do to stop it. The baby, a girl, lived about an hour. Vera felt tears pricking her eyes but refused to let them fall. I couldn't stay there. So I came here, bought the timber rights, and figured I'd just work until the pain went away, or I did, whichever came first. He turned to look at her directly. For 5 years, I've lived like I was already dead. Going through motions, doing work, but not really living. And then you showed up, and suddenly I'm feeling things I thought I'd buried with Emily. Vera's heart was pounding. Colton, let me finish. I know I'm not good company. I know I live in the hills like some kind of hermit. But when I saw you trapped by that fire, the thought of losing you was worse than anything I'd felt since Emily died. And that terrifies me. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Vera found herself moving closer, drawn by a force she could not resist. You're not too damaged. You're just hurt. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Hurt just means you need time to heal. She reached up, her hand trembling, and touched his face. He went very still, his eyes searching hers. I came here to start over, she said softly, to build something new. Maybe we both need to learn that starting over doesn't mean forgetting. It just means giving ourselves permission to live again. Colton's hand came up to cover hers. I don't know how to do this anymore. How to let someone in. Then we'll figure it out together. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away. But Vera did not want to pull away. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and searching. She answered by pressing closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart beating as frantically as her own. The kiss deepened, becoming something that spoke of loneliness and hope and the desperate courage it took to risk being hurt again. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. This is a mistake, he murmured, but his arms had come around her. Probably, she agreed, but I'm tired of playing it safe. People will talk. Let them talk. He pulled back enough to look at her, and she saw wonder mixed with wariness. You're sure about this? About me? I want to find out where this goes. That's enough for now. They walked back to town as the sun set, their hands linked. Vera felt a contentment she had not experienced in years. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Colton began taking meals at the boarding house when he was in town. He attended the church dedication and sat beside Vera during the service. They took walks together, talking about everything and nothing, building the foundation of something that might become lasting. The town watched and whispered, but most of the talk was approving. People had worried about their reclusive timberman, and seeing him reconnect with life pleased those who had cared from a distance. It was early December when Colton asked her to visit his camp. I'd like you to see where I live. If you're interested. Vera understood the significance. Colton had not brought anyone to his camp in 5 years. This was trust, offered hesitantly but sincerely. I'd like that very much. They set out on a Saturday morning, riding in Colton's wagon up a trail that climbed steadily into the foothills. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and snow. The camp was not what Vera had expected. She had imagined something rough and temporary, but instead found a well-constructed cabin with a stone chimney and glass windows. Inside, it was spartanly furnished but clean and orderly. What caught her attention was the cradle in the corner, beautifully made from cherry wood. Beside it, on a small shelf, was a photograph in a simple frame. Colton saw where her gaze had landed and crossed to pick up the photograph. Emily and me on our wedding day. The woman in the photograph was small and dark-haired, with a warm smile. Vera studied the image, trying to reconcile this younger version of Colton with the guarded man she knew. She was beautiful. She was everything. There was no bitterness in his voice, just acknowledgement of loss without denying the love that had preceded it. Vera handed the photograph back, and Colton returned it to its place with careful reverence. I kept these things as reminders. For a long time, I thought that was all I deserved. But lately, I've been thinking maybe I was wrong. Maybe holding on to grief so tightly was just another way of giving up. He turned to face her. I'll always love Emily. She'll always be part of who I am. But she's gone, and I'm still here, and I think maybe it's time I accepted that living isn't a betrayal of her memory. Vera crossed the space between them, taking his hands in hers. She would want you to be happy. I hope so, because I'm finding that I want to try again. With you, if you'll have me. I'm rather fond of you, Timberman. The kiss they shared this time was deeper, more confident, speaking of possibilities and promises that neither was quite ready to voice, but both felt building between them. They spent the day at the camp, and Colton showed her his operation. The timber claim covered several hundred acres, and he explained his selective cutting method, taking only matured trees and leaving enough to ensure the forest would regenerate. It was clear he loved the work and took pride in harvesting resources without destroying the future. As afternoon faded toward evening, they sat by the fire, drinking coffee and talking about plans. Their visions of the future began to intertwine, creating a picture of what life might look like if they continued down this path together. It was full dark when they finally loaded back into the wagon for the return journey. The temperature had dropped significantly, and Colton tucked blankets around Vera before taking up the reins. The trail down was treacherous in the darkness, requiring all of Colton's skill to navigate safely. They had covered perhaps half the distance when disaster struck. A deer burst from the underbrush directly in front of the team, startling the horses into a violent shy. The wagon lurched sideways, one wheel leaving the ground. Colton fought for control, but the angle was too severe. The wagon tipped. Vera felt herself falling, the world rotating impossibly. She hit the ground hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs, then felt herself sliding toward the edge of the trail where the ground dropped away into darkness. Her hands scrabbled for purchase, finding only loose dirt and stone. Then, suddenly, there was something solid, a root or branch. She grabbed it with both hands, her slide coming to an abrupt halt that wrenched her shoulders painfully. For several seconds, she hung there, unable to do anything but breathe. Then she heard Colton's voice, rough with fear. "Vera, where are you?" "Here, I'm here." She heard movement, then saw a light approaching. Colton appeared at the edge of the trail above her, holding a lantern. His face looked terrified. "Are you hurt?" "I don't think so. I caught hold of something." He moved the lantern, and they both saw her situation clearly. She had slid perhaps 15 feet down a steep slope and was holding on to a dead tree trunk that had fallen across the incline. Below her, the ground dropped away into a ravine at least 50 feet deep. Colton assessed the situation with quick judgment. "I'm going to throw you a rope. Can you hold on with one hand while you catch it?" "I think so." But when she tried to release her grip with her left hand, Pain shot through her shoulder and her fingers refused to cooperate. The fall had injured something. I can't. My shoulder won't work properly. She could see Colton thinking, running through options. Then he made a decision. I'm coming down. Don't let go. The ground is too unstable. You'll slide down too. Then we'll both hang on until I can get us out. I'm not leaving you there. He disappeared from view, and Vera heard sounds of movement above. Then he reappeared on the slope itself, having found a way to approach from an angle. He moved with careful precision, testing each step before committing his weight. When he reached her, he positioned himself above the fallen trunk, using it as an anchor. His left arm went around her waist, his right hand gripping the trunk near hers. I've got you. Can you climb up onto the trunk if I lift? I think so. But Colton, this trunk is old and weathered. Do you want to split me in half, cowboy? The words came out before she could stop them, born of fear and exhaustion. She was clinging to a trunk that looked ancient and brittle, doubting whether it could hold both their weights, terrified that her need to see his world would result in both their deaths. Colton's arm tightened around her, his voice close to her ear and remarkably calm. This trunk has been here for years and it's solid. See these roots? They're anchored deep. It'll hold both of us and probably a horse besides. I'm not planning on being split in half today, so let's focus on getting you to safety. Trust me? Yes. And she did. Despite the fear, despite the impossible position, she trusted this man completely. Colton lifted, his strength evident even with one arm, and Vera managed to get her knees onto the trunk. From there, it was a slow, careful climb back up the slope, with Colton guiding and supporting her every inch of the way. When they finally reached the trail, both collapsed onto solid ground, breathing hard. Colton pulled her against him, his heart hammering. Don't ever scare me like that again. I'll try not to fall down any more ravines. See that you don't. They sat there for long minutes, just breathing and holding each other. Finally, Colton stirred. We need to check the horses and right the wagon. Together they assessed the damage. The horses had broken free but had not run far. The wagon was on its side but structurally sound. With considerable effort, they managed to right it. The journey back to town took twice as long, both because of caution and because Colton refused to push the pace with Vera injured. When they finally rolled into Copper Ridge well after midnight, Mrs. Kowalski was waiting up, along with several others who had grown concerned. The story came out in pieces: the deer, the crash, Vera's slide, and Colton's rescue. Martha Webb immediately declared it the most romantic thing she had ever heard, which made both Colton and Vera laugh despite their exhaustion. But beneath the relief, something had shifted. They had faced death together twice now, and each time had chosen to hold on to each other. That night, as Vera lay in bed with her shoulder properly bandaged, she realized something profound. She had come west to build a new life based on independence. But she was learning that true strength was not about standing alone. It was about being brave enough to trust someone else to stand beside you. And Colton, damaged and careful and afraid of being hurt again, was learning the same lesson. Some things were worth the risk. Some people were worth trusting with the broken pieces of your heart. The winter snow came early that year, blanketing Copper Ridge in white and slowing life to match the season's rhythm. But in the quiet months that followed, something grew between a schoolteacher and a timber man. It grew slowly, carefully, built on trust earned through crisis and connection forged through honesty. They were both scarred by loss, both cautious with hope. But together, they were learning that the courage to start over was not about forgetting the past. It was about carrying those lessons forward while remaining brave enough to reach for something new, even when your hands were still shaking from the last time you fell. In the end, that was what love required, not perfection, but the willingness to climb back up after every fall, to trust the strength of what you built together, and to never let go, even when the ground beneath you gave way.